She went still in the middle of a sentence. The auditorium hush folded over a dozen suits and 100 polite faces. A microphone caught only the soft, surprised hitch in Alexandra Ashcroft's breath. Then nothing at all. Bernard Kellerman saw the drop in the room before anyone else. He had the reflex of work in his bones. Quick, efficient, no fuss. He was a janitor in a building of glass and certainty, a man who'd learned to move without making noise. He saw the fullness leave her, the color drain from the CEO who'd given speeches from that stage for years. He saw other people freeze with a million thoughts about liability and optics instead of one necessary human motion. Move. He moved. It was not a theatrical rush. Bernard's hands were the hands of someone who had cleaned up other people's mistakes long enough to know how to stay steady when the room spun. He pushed through a ring of startled executives and photographers, palms cracked from work and dipped in the smell of industrial bleach, and leaned over Alexandra's chest. He checked for a pulse with a thumb that smelled faintly of coffee and floor wax. He tilted her head, blew a breath into a mouth that tasted of stage makeup, and began compressions. 2 sets. 30, 30. The count, a rhythm he learned from a night of on-call training years ago. The clack of shoulders against stiff collars. Someone in the second row began to call 911, but Bernard kept the beat. Hard, chest compressions that drove air through a body that had stopped listening to itself. For the seconds that felt like an hour, there was only Bernard and the small mechanical insistence of his hands. When Alexander coughed, the air in the room exhaled all at once, like someone had taken a lid off a pressure cooker. She blinked open eyes that seemed surprised to be alive. She grabbed for a microphone not to speak, but to steady herself. And that was when someone with a camera took a still, and like lightning, a new story was made. That still would be the pivot. It would freeze the image of an ordinary man leaning over a powerful woman and let the world decide what it wanted to see in that frozen instant. Bernard walked out of the boardroom in the same coat he always wore, a thrifted navy jacket with a torn cuff, expecting a nod, maybe a murmured thanks. Instead, he felt the weight of 1,000 looks, some curious, many uncomfortable, a few openly hostile. A security guard asked him for ID. A manager whispered about breach of protocol. HR showed him a form and pointed at the exit. "Bernard," said one of the directors, the man whose shoes always shone like coin. "This puts the company at risk. We have procedures. You shouldn't have—" "I was doing what needed to be done," Bernard said. His voice didn't shake much, but it carried the tiredness of someone used to being invisible until something went wrong. She wasn't breathing. "There's liability."
"There's optics," the director repeated, as if he had argued the point to a committee and won. "We have to proceed by the book." Alexandra, blinking into a world that felt suddenly foreign, reached for him with a hand that was steadying, apologetic. "He saved me," she said, and the words cut a path through the murmurs. For a moment there was a ripple of understanding, but the ripple met a stone wall of concern about what would be printed tomorrow. Later that day, when the footage went public, the internet did what it always does with images. It simplified and sharpened everything. Somebody froze the frame at the angle that made Bernard look like he was towering over Alexandra, an ordinary man bent over a woman styled like power personified. Captions arrived within minutes. They chose a tone. The tone decided he was an opportunist. The tone preferred a narrative that fit a pre-existing suspicion about class, access, and unspoken rules. Bernard watched his life get captioned into a suspicion he had never asked for. He watched his hands, hands that had held mop handles for decades, and a child's head as she slept, be the subject of spite memories on forums. He saw the clip picked up by pundits who spoke like they were reading from a script about propriety. He saw strangers call him names. He saw street-level gossip turned into indictment. They fired him the following morning. The paperwork was neat and impersonal, for conduct inconsistent with company policies. The security footage that had captured his actions was simultaneously being used as the evidence that he had stepped out of bounds. No one seemed eager to remember that in the span of minutes, Alexandra had been saved by his hands. At home, the apartment smelled like boiled cabbage and the radiator's small hiss. Molly, 8 years old and half asleep on the couch, woke at the sound of her father's key. Her hair smelled like soap, and she would say later that she knew when her father was exhausted because his hands felt like someone had taken the warmth out of them. "You did a good thing, Daddy," she said, not understanding the way the world might punish good things. Bernard made her a bowl of noodles and sat at the table with the eviction notice he found wedged under a stack of other bills. His landlord's shorthand at the bottom read like a metronome: pay or vacate. The job had paid enough for rent and wood for the little repairs around the apartment, for the school supplies, for Molly's birthday cake. Without it, every scraped coin in his pocket suddenly mattered. He went out to look for work, but the city is a machine that favors faces it recognizes and credentials it can scan and categorize. He walked through construction sites and supermarkets, through the back corridors of hotels where his kind of work was known and yet always precarious.
He ran his resume into places that asked for references he didn't have, and a steady employment history that immediate-term layoffs had eroded. And the image kept circulating. The frame that once captured the rhythm of his hands saving life now invented motives and slotted him into boxes that didn't fit. People on phones spoke in absolutes they would never have claimed to a human face. A morning show host, a man named Richard Kavanaugh, who sat on more boards than most people could name, played the frozen frame across a ludicrously high-resolution screen and used a baritone that made the smear feel like a decree. "Look at this," Kavanaugh said, flipping his cufflinks with a hand the color of money. He was a billionaire investor who liked to be seen making judgments that simplified complex things. He laughed in a way that sounded like the clinking of glasses. "It's junk. That car, that whole look, it's junk." The line landed with a particular weight because Kavanaugh's voice carried with it the suggestion that if you could be dismissed by someone like him, you might as well be already discarded. Its junk was not about a vehicle in an isolated sense. It became shorthand for contempt, for poverty, for the wrong kind of background, for a worldview that divides people into what deserves dignity and what doesn't. The clip spooled through late-night hosts and midday commentators. Threads bloomed like mold. Why was he even allowed near the CEO? What else did he have access to? The phrasing was moral theater. People didn't see that the same man who had his arms around a mop for 20 years also had his arms around a child when she was sick, that he answered to alarm clocks no one else heard, or that he had gone to night shift CPR training because he worked nights in a building that held more than one kind of danger. Word traveled in the harshest possible currency. At the grocery, a cashier's eyes flicked away. On the bus, a woman shifted her bag. Parents at Molly's school kept a polite distance in the pickup line. The city is big enough to swallow a man, and small enough that a caption can make it happen. Janet Holloway, his neighbor, was the kind of person who understood the arithmetic of a life run on the margins. She was the one who brought warm bread by the apartment when Bernard stayed up late filing applications, placing them like small anchors to keep hope from floating away. She had an easy laugh and a pocket full of practical kindness, a screwdriver, a bottle of peroxide, an extra blanket. She observed the change with a kind of anger that was personal, because she had watched Bernard care for Molly the way a man cares for oxygen. "People who haven't had to stretch their pennies," Janet told him one night over stale crackers and strong tea, "think they own the right to decide what value is. They look at you and decide. That's not on you." "Feels like it," Bernard said. He didn't have the energy for more than that.
He watched Molly's school clothes wear thin along the elbows. He watched her tuck 3 coins into a jar labeled "Big Surprise" and feel deflected guilt for not being able to contribute more. Meanwhile, in a glass tower far above the street, Alexandra sat in a conference room replaying the footage. Alone, she watched her own collapse in raw frames, the blankness of a moment, the steady shoulders of a man she didn't know the name of until she saw the security log. How had she missed him? That question sat with a heavy private edge. She was used to screens and teams and buffers. She was not used to being so intimately indebted to someone who had been so invisible to the very systems she ran. When she called for a full review of the footage, there was the usual pushback: PR concerns, legal edges. Tyler Brigham, the CFO, was precise in the way administrators are precise when they are worried about the perimeter of their authority. "We need to think about what gets out," he said with a clinical calm that implied strategy, not empathy. "There are optics to consider." Alexandra watched his lips form the word optics, and for the first time she understood how that word could be weaponized. It had been used as armor in meetings. Now it seemed to be a blade aimed where it could hurt the most visible part of the company, its public face. It hurt that Bernard, who had acted without protocol but with profound humanity, would be a casualty of that lexicon. She tracked him down through a combination of determination and guilt. Someone in facilities remembered a name pinned to a mop bucket, a maintenance log with a handwriting that wasn't pretty but was legible enough. She left a message that said only, "I owe you," and waited. Bernard returned her call because he believed, still stubbornly, that a person in power could say the right thing. He arrived at a small visitor entrance with Molly in tow. She had a stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. It smelled faintly of dryer sheets and held the small private world where her father's presence made everything secure. Alexandra met them away from cameras, in a glass room that filtered the city like an impressionist painting. She came not as a suit to be praised, but as a human who had been unexpectedly held to account by the simplest act of survival. "You saved me," she said. "You saved my life. I'm sorry. I'm sorry you were treated like that." He looked at her as if the word sorry were a thin thing without action. "What now?" he asked. The question wasn't harsh. It was practical. Molly's small hand twisted in his fingers. He had already filed an appeal for unemployment. He had called the landlord again. He had learned, in the space of a few days, that public life could be both tremendously generous and indiscriminately cruel. Alexandra did something that surprised a lot of people. She put her authority where her words were.
She personally arranged for immediate funds to get the eviction notice paused. She called in Fiona Redford, her assistant, who had a way of cutting through bureaucracy with a stack of stamped forms. She asked HR to freeze any disciplinary findings until a full review could be completed. She offered, clumsily perhaps, but with a genuine desire to repair, to help Bernard find work in a role that had meaning beyond a badge and a schedule, an advisory position to help design a company employee welfare initiative, someone with lived experience who could shape policy with the force of what he had actually lived through. Bernard hesitated because dignity is not something always purchased by public statements. It can be cheapened by pity. So he said nothing at first. He watched Alexandra's face, which had the tired lines of someone who had called too many meetings and then discovered what decisions really cost. He saw that she was not performing remorse for cameras. She was raw, and, to his surprise, human. "Why would you do this?" he asked. "Because I can't look at what happened and pretend the world won't ask for more than just words," she said. "Because I can't ask someone to risk themselves and then wash my hands of the consequences. This starts with you." Her sincerity landed like a small beam of possibility. For someone who had been increasingly invisible, being asked to help craft systemic change felt like being given the benefit of a perspective many in power lacked. He accepted, slowly. He would not be a token, he insisted on that. He would be a voice, and he would do it on his terms and for his daughter's future. The company issued a quiet press note, measured, cautious. It acknowledged an incident and thanked first responders. It did not yet go as far as naming Bernard a hero, but Alexandra personally gave a notarized statement clearing him of punitive claims tied to the day she had nearly died on stage. That document, official and precise, was something the internet could not immediately erase. For a few days there was a pause that felt like breath being held. Bernard moved temporarily into an apartment arranged through company housing, modest, clean, with new sheets and a kettle that hissed politely in the morning. Molly had a desk with a lamp that finally didn't flicker. He began meeting with Alexandra and a small team of people who wanted to build something more than PR, a program of real support. Emergency funds, counseling, reliable childcare, protections from retaliatory smear tactics. The meetings were sometimes halting. People who had never lived with scarcity asked questions with naive curiosity. Bernard answered from the hard detail of his life. The jittery worry of a phone that never held enough minutes. The shame of calling a school and asking for a temporary waiver. The way pride sits like gravity and makes you think twice.
Tyler Brigham watched those meetings with a professional expression that hid something colder. He was not just worried about perception. He was worried about precedent. A program that acknowledged real vulnerability and gave agency to people like Bernard shifted where responsibility landed. It could cost the company money. It could require cultural humility on levels executives were not trained to deliver. Tyler made a note, quiet and swift, that the company could not become a platform for anecdotal governance. He bought ad space on a small financial newsletter that liked to promote stewardship and restraint. Richard Kavanaugh, the Billionaire board member who had said, "It's junk," about Bernard's car, was not satisfied with commentary. He liked to shape conversations with blunt instruments. He took to a popular business podcast and, with the casual authority of someone who had never been asked to account for the preferences that lined his bank account, used the still frame to build a story about security, access, and the need for corporate boundaries. "That car," he said again, as if repetition made truth, "is junk. Why is someone with that standard of living that low in the building? Who would let that happen? Kavanaugh's voice was a match. It caught in others' mouths. Other voices picked up the phrase, because outrage is contagious and contempt travels faster than curiosity. The mockery attached itself to Bernard's life. His old car, a battered sedan with a dent in the passenger door and a heater that sometimes took a minute to warm up, was suddenly not merely a vehicle, but a symbol for everything the pundits could mock without noticing their cruelty. And then escalation arrived like a weather front. It was not a natural storm. It had edges of intention. One evening, weeks after Alexandra had offered the program and the company had frozen disciplinary action, Bernard drove out to his small garage, a narrow strip behind a row of brick townhomes, where tenants kept extra boxes and the seasonal cools you rotate between. He chose to park there because it held a kind of privacy the street did not. Molly had painted a small star on the garage door with supervision and pride, a child's stubborn claim on a place that was theirs in a city that often seemed to forget them. The night was windless, the city lights orangely muted through a light haze. He walked to the garage carrying a toolbox, a practical man with work to do, locks to lubricate, an old carburetor to inspect for the kitten of a side hustle he was trying to start, things that seemed small but might make a difference in a month when the rent was due. He liked the ritual of work, the way physical tasks no longer demanded the emotional currency the rest of life did. Something was wrong before he reached the door. He could smell the sharp metallic tang that comes with machinery, and something else, burning, low and acrid.
There were shapes in the dim light, silhouettes that did not belong to the neighborhood's usual drift of late-night comings and goings. The sound that cut across the space was not just the city. It was human, invasive, purposeful. He thought at first it could be vandals, kits, the kind who broke windows for fun or kicked in trash cans. He called out in a voice used to being spoken in the back halls. "Hey, who's there?" No answer. The garage lock, new, probably reliable, was bent and loosened. The star Molly had painted was smudged with grease, as if hands had brushed it on purpose. Then the first blow came, a shove from a shoulder that smelled of cheap cologne and the wetness of sweat. Another set of hands grabbed at him. He fought the way you fight when you have to, with elbows and a scream that rang thin in the street. He reached for the person who had pushed him, and a second figure came from the side. The shove knocked him into the door jamb. An arm, heavy and practiced, caught his ribs, and something hard hit his back with a force that spun him off balance. He fell. The ground was cold, the grit infusing the palms in his hand. He tried to turn. Pain bloomed in a way he had never known, not the sharp, localized kind that would have been easy to name and treat, but a spreading, incongruous numbness that felt like fingers of frost stealing his connection to the rest of his body. He tried to stand and found that his legs would not answer. He could not feel the familiar weight of them, the usual bony map he used to balance himself. For a moment, he thought he might have been kicked in the legs, but it wasn't that. It was an absence of control, a curious betrayal that made the world tilt and go away from him. Bernard's brain did what it always did when urgency pressed in. It checked. He inhaled and tried to speak. His voice came out as a strangled thing. Molly's name rose in his throat because she lived at the center of all his fear. Then the other rhythm began, the barking of a car starting, the shutter of a door closing, footsteps running away. He lay there on cold concrete, hands pressed to a chest that felt small under him, thinking of hospital rooms and the odd business of how quickly life can change in one night. He was not alone long. A neighbor heard the scuffle and called out, lantern trembling in hand. Janet was there within minutes because she lived near enough to run the way neighbors used to run. Her face was a hard map of alarm when she saw him on the ground. "Bernard," she cried. Her voice was both question and prayer. She crouched and checked him the way someone who had known him for years might, hands on his shoulders, looking for the sign of normalcy. He could not feel his legs. Panic and lucidity braided in a way that made him shiver. The neighbor's lantern glared down, white and brutal. Someone else was on the line with 911. Sirens came, a sound that always felt like a promise and a threat in equal measure.
Paramedics arrived and moved around with sanctioned efficiency. Questions, quick checks, murmured instructions. They were careful not to promise what they could not guarantee. They strapped him to a board with a careful tenderness that recognized the likelihood of a spinal injury, but did not want to name it like a verdict. When paramedics lifted him, Molly arrived at the scene, because the world narrows in crisis, and a child will know the direction of a parent's voice like a compass. She stood at the edge of the police tape, pressed her palms to her mouth, and looked at the body of the man who had always been her house and her small orbit. Her face was a tiny thing framed by the enormous clinical lights. Alexandra, who had been working late and had a company vehicle available if needed, was driving as fast as policy and conscience allowed. She had been tracking the reports from her building, the small human threads she had tried to stitch back together.
A call came through. "We have Bernard Kellerman at the West Block garage, possible assault and injury." The words landed with the cold precision of the unknown. At the hospital, the staff moved with the slow, decisive choreography of people who know that naming a condition prematurely helps no one. Bernard was carried into the emergency room, and somewhere between the harsh lights and the polite clatter of machines, he lost the practical, ordinary parts of himself that made life predictable. The technicians did their checks, and the faces of professionals were inscrutable. They offered oxygen, words of reassurance, and the procedural kindness of clinical phrases. Later, in a sterner hallway with a chair and a cup of coffee that sat untouched, Alexandra watched through glass as a team consulted over imaging screens she could not interpret. The word they used in low, precise tones was not dramatized, it was clinical and weighty: a spinal cord injury. Not every variety promised the same outcome, and a full prognosis required specialists and time. Words were careful because false hope does harm as well. Bernard lay in a hospital bed with monitors that hummed like a distant engine. He could not move his legs. That was the simplest, most undeniable fact. The doctors spoke into notebooks and avoided overpromising. They told the family, gently, that he had likely sustained a spinal cord injury that resulted in paralysis of his lower body. They did not offer miraculous cures. They offered a course of assessment and therapy, and an honest conversation about the fact that recovery, when it happens, takes time, rigor, and support. They recommended a specialist consult. They suggested arrangements for immediate care and rehabilitation assessment. They did not tell stories of miraculous recovery. They described with clinical clarity the work that lay ahead: phased rehabilitation, assistive devices, adaptive home modifications for a life that would be different in design but not in purpose.
Outside the sterile light of the hospital, the world reacted. The smear pick that had started months ago now tumbled into darker territory. The narrative that had been built to shame and ridicule, the junk assessment of a life, now hovered at the edges of something worse: deliberate escalation. Clues began to surface like small, stubborn weeds. Security camera footage from the alley behind the garages captured a dark SUV idling well past midnight on 2 separate nights. Fingerprints on a bent padlock returned to a rental shop with a traceable account. An anonymous tip arrived at a local paper, pointing toward a pattern of intimidation. Tyler Brigham's careful memos had escalated into action by people who believed that pressure could make a story disappear. Whether Tyler himself had ordered hands to move, or whether he had created an atmosphere in which someone else chose to use their hands, remained a question. It was a question that would require evidence, and that evidence would be a map of decisions and accomplices. For now, the line between what was negligence and what was criminal would blur in the public's imagination, and the company would have to decide if its silence was complicity. Alexandra sat in a narrow chair for hours, the lights around her soft like a concession. She had always believed in systems. Now she was forced to reckon with the fact that systems fail people who are used to falling through their cracks. Bernard lay compromised on the other side of the glass, his face pale and still, his hands curled like a man who had already sized his new life by what he could grasp. Molly held a small rabbit in her lap, while Janet sat on the edge of the bed and murmured reassurances that had trouble finding their footing in such a strange terrain. They were too early in the timeline to hope for clear public exoneration. They were, however, at the beginning of an outrage that would not quiet because the wound was visible. Outside, the city kept turning. Cameras buzzed and phones flashed. Richard Kavanaugh's prettier mocking voice had become background static to something more urgent and terrifying. People who had been loud with their judgments went quieter when the possibility of culpability moved toward the players who had been throwing stones. A few commentators asked the questions that seemed suddenly unavoidable. Who benefits from silencing a man who could testify to corporate culture? Who found it convenient to erase a life that had been inconveniently visible? Bernard lay there, the janitor who had saved a life, the father whose child was now watching the world rearrange itself around an injury she could not name, and the room felt like a container for a story that had not yet decided what it would be. Would it become a lesson in how power finally answers for the small harms it is used to ignoring? Or would it be another headline about a man who lived on the edges and then disappeared?
He opened his eyes and saw Alexandra across the glass, not the public face, but a person who had been saved by someone she had scarcely known. She watched him with quiet fury that had nowhere easy to land but in action. She reached out her hand and placed it on the glass between them, steady and intent. "Bernard," she said, voice low and raw, "I will do what it takes." He tried to nod. The nod felt small and imperfect. He thought of Molly and the rabbit, and Janet, and the toolbox he had never finished using.
He thought of an old car with a dent in the passenger door, and a woman who had said the words that made the night sharper. It's junk. He thought about how easily other people's judgments had built the night that had brought him here. Outside the hospital, more than one leader in a suit convened to define their course. Tyler wrote memos that insisted on a narrow focus and a measured public statement. Others, Alexandra among them, found that measured language did not match the scale of what must be repaired. There was an ethical squeeze in the room between protecting shareholders and protecting humans. When the first police report leaked, it did not tell the whole story. It hinted at the possibility of intentional sabotage. It named a vehicle seen leaving the scene. It listed a time. It asked more questions than it answered. For Bernard, those questions did not make his legs move again. They did, however, suggest that the small, seemingly trivial insults that had been cast at his life were not harmless. They had been part of an orchestration that would now be scrutinized. Molly leaned her forehead against the hospital glass and listened to the humming of machines. She did not yet understand everything that would follow. She only knew the person behind the show and the person now in the hospital bed were very much the same man. She pressed her palms to the glass as if to say, "Daddy, come back to me whole in whatever shape whole is now." Janet promised to bring soup. Fiona, quietly efficient, began to assemble the paperwork Alexandra would need to push for a full public investigation. Alexandra drafted a statement that balanced sorrow with an insistence on accountability, knowing that the world would be ready to parse every word. And somewhere in the back rooms where rumor breeds, Richard Kavanaugh's "It's junk" echoed in the ears of people who would not have said something so blunt without permission. It is one thing to mock a dented hood on a car. It is another to make a callousness seem normal. The phrase had worked its way into a narrative that now made escalation possible. Bernard, as he lay there, felt the paradox of his life with a peculiar clarity. He had been a hero in a room full of people who did not know what to do with the sight of a man saving a woman of power. In the aftermath, the same world that failed to thank him would shape his new reality with judgments and actions that did not consider the cost.
The first night in the hospital was a blur of monitors, pallid light, and the small practical logistics of a life shifted. He could not stand. He could not feel his legs. The doctors used careful, factual language. He wanted to scream. Instead, he spoke softly to Molly, who had dozed on a plastic chair with a blanket pulled up to her chin. "It'll be okay, kiddo," he told her, meaning what a man must mean when a child needs certainty in a world that no longer offers it. She turned her face up to him and smiled a tiny, brave smile. "You're my hero," she said. The words were both seed and burden. Alexandra, hands clasped, felt the strange new definition of responsibility pull tight. She had the power to set wheels in motion. The company under her watch could do more than issue statements. It could, if she allowed it, dismantle a structure that had let someone fall so publicly and painfully. It could create a program that might keep another person from being made invisible and then abused for that invisibility. It could fund rehabilitation. It could change security protocols. It could ensure that smear campaigns did not escalate into violence. But for bureaucracy to become justice, she had to be willing to be more than a sponsor. She had to submit herself to the work of accountability. Outside, cameras recorded the ambulance leaving. A clip of the scene hit feeds within an hour, grainy and heartless and utterly public. The same people who had cheered a pundit's cruel joke now faced the reality that words could lead to harm. The narrative would splinter into 1,000 versions, those who blamed the victim, those who insisting on conspiracy, those who demanded the company answer for its culture. The truth would be harder to assemble than the frames that made it news. Bernard slept and woke in fragments, aware that his life had been rearranged by the night. He had saved a life and now needed a new one sketched out around him. The injury was a fact, the social smear a separate fact, the mockery by a wealthy voice another fact. Then there was the thing that would not fit on any list, the small human acts that would be required to make his life livable again. He would learn how to use a ramp. He would learn the names for equipment and benefits. He would learn how to sign forms and how to ask for care in ways that did not make him feel diminished. He would also find himself in meetings, a chair between executives and spreadsheets, and speak about toilets and transportation and childcare in ways that would be read either as expert testimony or as an inconvenient reminder. The trajectory of his life had curved into something neither he nor anyone else had scripted. At the center of that curve was a woman whose breath he had left and started, a boardroom that had frozen like a photograph, a viral clip that had become a spear, and a billionaire's dismissal that had become a kind of permission.
The scene in the garage, the shove, the fall, the fractured control of limbs had translated mockery into injury. And so the story widened. It asked difficult things of people with authority. It asked for action, not statements. It asked for repair, not platitudes.
It asked a billionaire's board and a city's legal apparatus to look at how public language can create private peril. It asked a community to stand in ways it had not yet proved it could. It asked Bernard to be more than a man surviving his own life. It asks him to become someone who could carry other people's failures into the light and turn them into policy. He lay in the bright hospital room and listened to the slow tick of monitors. Molly slept with a hand on his arm. Janet hummed a tune under her breath. Alexandra's reflection hovered on the glass like an absentee sun. The city's noise filtered through the panes, a distant, indifferent heartbeat. For Bernard, for the family around him, for the company that had to choose what kind of leadership it would be, the night had remade everything into a question that had to be answered, not by words, but by the long, arduous work of repair and truth. He counted the small things he still had: Molly's hand in his, the bowl of noodles in the kitchen, the blue star on the garage door, nicked and slightly smeared. They would have to be enough while the world decided whether to be better. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of small, necessary things and larger, slower reckonings. News cycles churned. Lawyers began to circulate names instead of questions. Internal investigators moved through glass corridors with clipboards and neutral faces. The city that had been quick to judge now had to answer harder questions about who made the call to shame and who benefited from letting shaming slide into something more dangerous. If this story is finding you, if the simple fact that one person's life became an object lesson in how language and power collide matters to you, there are more chapters to come. Stay with it. Inside the hospital, Bernard learned how to measure days in increments that had nothing to do with the calendar. There were therapies that taught him how to shift his weight in a way that made transfers to a wheelchair safer, how to use upper body strength to do things he had taken for granted. There were good days and bad days. Sometimes progress was a hand that reached a shelf and took down a cereal box without help. Other days were long, shoulders knotted with grief over routines that would no longer be simple. He met with occupational therapists who listened and suggested adaptations without sentimentality. They talked about ramps and grab bars, and the technical names for equipment he began to collect in his head, not because he loved the terms, but because they were tools to keep his life functional. He learned repeatedly that a future with paralysis was not the end of meaning. It was a rearrangement that required patience, money, and steady hands. Molly learned too. She learned how to fold clothes differently so her father could reach them. She learned how to speak to nurses and what it meant to be the kind of child who could carry the small dignity of a parent through a world that suddenly needed help. Janet came every morning with fresh bread and a grim determination. She sat in the chair by the bed and hummed the same old lullaby, as if repetition could stitch the day a little smaller and softer. Alexandra moved through those days like someone who had been given a second, unwelcome glimpse into the machinery of harm that invisibility creates. Her first instinct had been to fix immediately: the housing, the eviction hold, the notary statement. Now the scope of repair felt bigger. She assembled a working group, Fiona at her side to make bureaucracy obedient to kindness, Marcus from security to handle evidence and to rewrite protocols so that surveillance was used to protect employees rather than to expose them to public humiliation. A thoughtful senior HR director who had quietly championed low-level reforms for years, and Bernard himself, who sat in the meeting with the slow dignity of someone who had been forced into a public role and refused to be a showpiece. Tyler watched those meetings with a face grown thin with worry. He spoke in memos and in corridors about precedent and fiduciary duty, about the slippery slope that anecdote makes when it becomes policy. He insisted on cautious language in public statements and fretted over market reaction. He purchased ads in financial newsletters that praised prudence and warned against performative governance. His words were measured, their implications were not. Outside the clean rooms of corporate strategy, a quieter, scrappier investigation began. Marcus had started where cameras often begin, at pixels and timestamps. The alley footage that first captured the SUV idling past midnight was enhanced, sequences stitched together, license plates traced to a rental agency. A rental agreement, under a name that turned out to be a shell, connected to a prepaid card that had been funded by a vendor who had done work for the company. No trail was accidental, but neither was it instantly obvious. Marcus followed leads the way janitors follow dirt, patiently and without glamour. Fiona pushed for a full procurement audit, and the audit returned transaction names that had links to an outside PR consultant who boasted of reputation management and had previously worked on campaigns that blurred the lines between message discipline and smear. Evidence, even when it accumulates, does not always tell its full story in a courtroom-ready sentence, but it can create pressure. It can stitch a pattern.
It can make a board of directors, who had been inclined to protect the perimeter of their stock value, lean in long enough to ask for more than spin. Tyler responded with thin, legalistic rage. He fired off emails insisting that the company could not be judged on one night of noise. He warned of litigation if the company acted hastily. He pleaded, in performance reviews and in private calls, for the board to be reasonable. A small subset of the board did not want to see its name entangled with allegations of intimidation. Another subset, people who could imagine the human consequences of silence, began to side with Alexandra. The first public accountability was careful in its language, but unmistakable in its reach. A report released by the company acknowledged that the initial disciplinary action against Bernard had been premature, and that an internal review had found failures in how the incident was handled. It did not close all questions. It promised a deeper, independent investigation into the allegations of intimidation and sabotage. It announced an interim welfare program pilot with concrete features, emergency housing funds, an anonymous reporting hotline directly routed to a third-party ombudsman, expedited care and rehabilitation grants for employees injured in the line of duty, and anti-retaliation protections that included swift investigative timelines. Bernard read the report with a mixture of relief and careful detachment. Words on paper could open a door, but it was the work beyond the lines, the remodeling of a bathroom to be accessible, the arrangement of physical therapy appointments, the caseworker assigned to help him navigate benefits, that made life smoother in a way that could be counted. Alexandra made sure those changes happened quickly. She signed approvals late into the night. She attended a therapy session once, unannounced, and sat in a corner watching Bernard work on a transfer, his jaw set in concentration. She felt a kind of small, private humility that was not performative but that demanded action. Public opinion shifted, slowly and unevenly. The pundits who had gleefully replayed the still frame found themselves confronted with a story that had inconveniently real consequences. Some retracted or moderated, others doubled down with evasions. Richard Kavanaugh, whose "it's junk" line had circulated as an emblem of contempt, issued a short, formal statement of regret when the rental records and vendor payments began to form a pattern that connected to people in his social orbit. The statement avoided naming culpability and read like a carefully crafted exercise in damage control. It did not erase the sting his earlier baritone had inflicted. Legal action followed its own rhythms. There were inquiries from law enforcement into the alleged sabotage of Bernard's garage and the assault that accompanied it. Investigators subpoenaed records, correlated timestamps, and interviewed vendors.
The work moved with the slow deliberation of institutions that prefer certainty before accusation. Tyler insisted he had no role in telling anyone to commit violence. Those who worked under him said, in private, that his memos had created a climate where pressure to protect the brand was interpreted by some as permission to act outside boundaries. Whether that inference would be enough to hold him legally culpable was a question for courts and prosecutors. For the company, political and reputational calculus required quicker remedies. Those remedies started with personnel shifts. Managers who had championed the punitive optics-first approach were reassigned or placed on leave pending further review. An HR leader who had advocated for empathy and for practical support was promoted to lead the welfare initiative. The company created a new position, Head of Employee Dignity, intended to ensure that the policies under discussion translated into enforceable protocols rather than remaining comforting language. Bernard, who had at first resisted being a symbol, found that his lived experience mattered in ways he had not expected. He joined the working group not as someone who wanted to be placated, but as someone determined to make sure the program addressed the messy reality of scarcity. He argued for an easily accessible emergency fund with a clear, non-judgmental application process. He insisted that any reporting line protect victims from being identified publicly. He talked bluntly and with practical detail about transportation barriers and the impossibility of attending therapy sessions you couldn't afford to get to. He sketched the small touches that make a difference: on-demand childcare vouchers, guaranteed short-term salary when workers are removed from hazardous tasks, temporary housing assistance for families facing eviction, all things he had whispered about in the nights before Alexandra stepped in. There were measurable early wins. In the first month of the pilot program, the company reported that 72 employees had used the emergency fund for crises ranging from urgent child care to housing stabilization. 34 workers accessed counseling services without fear of reprisal. A fast-track reimbursement system allowed injured employees to get wheelchairs and adaptive equipment months earlier than was typical. The company published these numbers with the caveat that they were early and incomplete, and advocates outside the corporation noted that such transparency was rare and necessary.
Bernard read the figures and felt something like cautious vindication, not because numbers erased the violence he had endured, but because they meant other people might not fall through the same holes. Alexandra did not assume that policy alone would fix culture. She began regular town halls where employees could speak without hierarchy and put pressure on executives to answer plainly.
She committed to funding a foundation that partnered with local nonprofits to pay for home modifications and community-based rehab centers. She insisted, more controversially, on a transparency policy. When incidents like Bernard's occurred, the company would release a basic factual outline and the steps it intended to take. That angered some shareholders who preferred silence to scrutiny, but it also rallied employees who had long felt unseen. Tyler's position weakened. A procurement ledger showed payments to the firm that had initiated the smear campaign. A few suppliers, when asked direct questions, admitted to following instructions handed down from a division that answered to Tyler's office. He gave interviews insisting on his innocence, and privately sought legal protection. The board, under pressure from multiple directions, legal, ethical, public, placed him on administrative leave pending an independent inquiry. The company's statement was careful. Investigations were underway, any wrongdoing would be dealt with, and due process would be observed. Tyler, who had once enjoyed the quiet power of orchestrating narratives from behind a desk, found himself subject to the very scrutiny he had weaponized. For Bernard, the practicalities of daily life took center stage. Fiona helped arrange the adaptive van that allowed him to drive Molly to school when needed. Marcus made sure security policies were updated so that staff did not have to hide their personal vehicles in far-off lots. A grants manager helped him apply for public assistance programs he had never needed before, and for the first time in months, there was a paper trail that made his life less precarious. The company paid for a therapist for Molly when she began to show signs of trauma, night terrors and sudden quiet spells that Janet noticed and reported with the clarity of someone who loved the child like her own. At home, routines altered and sometimes groaned. The apartment they had moved into was more accessible, a wider doorway, a ramp, bathroom fixtures that allowed Bernard to maintain some independence. The blue star on the garage door was gone, the paint scraped off by the very hands that had bent the lock, but Molly painted a new star on a small wooden board and placed it on a nail inside her room. It was private and bright and belonged to them. There was grief. Bernard spent long afternoons watching the city from the new apartment window, a notebook on his lap where he wrote the things he needed to do and the ways he wanted systems to change. He mourned the small freedoms he had once taken for granted, the ability to stand for hours to do a job, the physical ease of lifting a box, the autonomy of movement. Those losses were real and present.
He also found small pleasures. Molly's laugh when she discovered a stray worm in the garden. The way Janet could make a joke that broke a room-wide tension in half. The smell of coffee in the morning when someone else made it because he couldn't stand long enough to brew. Months layered into a kind of forward motion. The independent investigation into the garage incident produced a thorough report that identified several parties who had acted in ways that warranted criminal inquiry. It did not answer every question in one sentence. It cataloged a chain of communications, a pattern of choices, and a culture where rhetorical permission to manage optics had been interpreted by some as a license to escalate. Law enforcement made targeted arrests of individuals who had been paid to carry out the intimidation. Investigative journalists traced the flow of funds and pointed to a pattern in which several outside consultants, hired under urgency and secrecy, had blurred ethical lines. Tyler's departure from the company was messy and in some quarters contested. He denied personal culpability but acknowledged that his memos had created an environment where people believed results mattered more than process. He resigned under the weight of political pressure and public scrutiny. He later contested aspects of the investigative findings through legal counsel. The company published an accountability summary that outlined personnel changes, the steps taken to prevent future abuses, and the timeline for implementing long-term cultural reforms. Bernard watched as names were stripped of titles and replaced with new people who had a mandate to care for employees rather than to protect image. He sat in one of those orientation sessions when the new head of employee dignity, an HR veteran who had started in custodial work decades ago and rose to empathy and procedural rigor, outlined mandatory training for executives about power dynamics and the ethics of public communication. The training included case studies drawn partly from Bernard's experience. He listened to his own life read back at him in the language of policy and felt both uncomfortable and oddly satisfied. He had insisted on practical protections. Now he watched them move from a proposal into a curriculum.
Public attention culminated in a conference months after the hospital night that had remade the map of their lives. The event focused on corporate accountability and workplace dignity. Alexandra had asked Bernard to speak. She did not ask him to perform gratitude. She asked him to tell his truth. The conference hall was an ocean of chairs. Reporters leaned forward. Molly sat in the front row with Janet on one side and Fiona on the other. Alexandra took a seat in the middle of the audience, unadorned and quietly visible. She had often been photographed at podiums looking like an image of resolution.
Now her face was marked by the softer lines of someone who had been made responsible in a very human way. Bernard's voice, when he stood, was not that of a polished speaker, rehearsed in rhetoric. It was the voice of a man who had washed floors at midnight, and who now held a microphone with a kind of careful authority. He did not ask for pity, he did not offer a sermon, he simply spoke. He told them about the night in the auditorium, the silence before he moved, the sound of a cough that felt like a small victory. He told them how the image had been frozen and turned into accusation, how a mocking phrase about junk had spread, and how that phrase had been a kind of permission for something worse to follow. He spoke plainly about the attack in the garage, not to dramatize but to anchor the story in consequences. He told them about Molly's small hands and the way she painted stars. He spoke about the hard day-to-day work of adapting to disability, the ramps and transfers, the therapies, the smallisms of dignity. Then he read from the list he had kept in his notebook, the practical proposals he wanted to see embedded in corporate life. He asked companies to fund emergency assistance with low barriers to access. He demanded anti-retaliation clauses enforced by independent auditors. He urged for on-site counseling and guaranteed leave that made it possible for workers to recover without the existential terror of eviction. He asked for transparent, accountable processes around security and public communications so that people could not be weaponized through imagery and cheap talk. He did not ask for revenge. He asked for systems that honored human lives. The room listened. When he finished, the applause was long and not theatrical. People stood. Some in the audience had been in the rooms where decisions had once been made without much thought to people like Bernard. Now they stood too, as if acknowledgement could be a first step. Alexandra stood as well and would not move to the podium. She had done things already. Housing, funds, policy changes, and she wanted the speech to be about Bernard and not about her role. But after the event, behind closed doors and on the safer turf of after-conference coffee, she and Bernard sat and talked about the program's expansion. They sketched out a partnership with local nonprofits to co-manage the emergency fund so that it would be insulated from corporate conflicts. They discussed pilot metrics, how many people used the fund, how quickly payments were made, how many abusive incidents were reported and properly investigated. Numbers mattered because they translated empathy into measurable action. In the months that followed, the program expanded beyond the initial pilot. It was adopted with modifications by several other companies that had followed the story.
Nonprofits that specialized in workplace justice reported an uptick in requests for partnership, and advocacy groups began to compile resources for employees who needed help navigating complex systems. Bernard helped train other companies on the lived realities of frontline workers. He would later joke, with a small, dry smile, that once he had hated public speaking, but had learned to see it as a useful annoyance. The legal cases continued to unfold in their own slow way. Criminal charges against individuals involved in the garage attack proceeded through the courts. Tyler's involvement remained contested in civil proceedings, with parts of investigatory findings shaping depositions and negotiations. The company faced lawsuits and counterclaims that would take years to fully resolve. Throughout, Alexandra insisted on transparency around personnel decisions and continued investment in the structural supports that had begun in the wake of the crisis. Bernard's life, by the time a year had passed, had the texture of endurance and new purpose. He was not the same man as before the night at the auditorium and the night at the garage. Those events had altered him in ways he grieved and in ways he could not have imagined. He still washed dishes sometimes at the community center near their apartment, because he liked the rhythm and because work, even part-time, steadied him. He attended rehabilitation sessions and sometimes spoke to medical students about the human side of healthcare, reminding them that compassion and logistics must move together. Molly thrived in a way that sometimes surprised him. She joined an after-school art program paid for in part by the foundation Alexandra had helped create. She learned to swim. She learned multiplication tables. She asked once in a small voice while painting a clay rabbit if Daddy would ever walk again. He did not lie. He told her some days would become easier and some would not. He told her that walking was not the only way to be whole. She considered that and nodded, drawing confident short lines on the clay.
Janet helped collect volunteers for home repairs. Fiona quietly managed the paperwork that made reimbursement possible without endless waits. Marcus redesigned security protocols so that access control favored human dignity over spectacle. Guard training emphasized de-escalation and on-the-spot support rather than immediate public callouts. The head of employee dignity championed a public dashboard that reported on program uptake and remedial actions, numbers that were not meant to be showy but that made change visible. There were setbacks. Funding cycles tightened in some quarters, complacency threatened in others. The smear culture that had encouraged mockery did not evaporate overnight. Some reporters went back to their old habits, hungry for the dramatic. There were legal delays and procedural frustrations that tested everyone's patience.
Bernard had days where the weight of all of it, his physical dependence, the media cycles, the slow progress, felt like too much. On one such afternoon, he received an envelope that contained a letter from a worker in a small manufacturing plant across the state. The worker wrote that she had been bullied by a supervisor, and that the company's new anonymous hotline had allowed her to report without fear. Her account led to an intervention that had kept her job and her housing. She thanked Bernard for speaking out, for shaping a system that made a practical difference in her life. He read the letter with a steady hand. Molly curled up beside him, reading a comic book, and he felt a small but profound obligation to keep pushing. That letter was the kind of quiet vindication that could not be televised, but that mattered more than any headline. It meant he had helped turn a painful event into a mechanism that could protect someone else. Years later, years still marked by clinics, by adaptive tools, by long conversations about politics and power, Bernard stood before another small crowd at a civic hall to discuss workplace dignity. He spoke about the odd alliances that reform requires, the billionaire who admitted error and used power to repair, the neighbor who brought bread, the HR director who believed in empathy as a discipline, the head of security who began to think of cameras less as evidence for punishment and more as protection for people. He spoke of his daughter and her clay rabbits. Afterwards, Alexandra placed a hand on his shoulder, the way people touch in places where gratitude and accountability meet. "You changed the company," she said simply. "You changed things that I didn't know how to change by myself." He smiled, the smile of someone who would learn to carry scars without letting them dictate the full arc of his life. "We did what we had to," he said, "and we kept remembering the small things that actually keep people from falling." The narrative that had begun with a cough in an auditorium and a still frame frozen by an impatient internet had widened into something more durable. Policies that changed quick cash availability for workers in crisis, protections against public smearing, a workplace bureau that listened to people who had previously been called invisible, and a community response network that provided therapists, home modifications, and legal support. Bernard never pretended that his life was simple. The paralysis remained a lived condition, one that required ongoing therapy, periodic equipment upgrades, and a daily negotiation with autonomy. He did not ask to be read as a triumphant comeback story, because there are too many ways in which life after injury is a recreation rather than a reversal. He accepted, however, that his experience could be a lever.
He used his voice to push for change, to teach people in offices how to listen, to advise on what real support looked like when bureaucrats tried to dress compassion in policy. There was a private moment, months after the public speeches and the program rollouts, where Bernard and Molly walked to a small park near their building. It was early evening, and the sky had the color of cooling tea. A man pushed his child on a swing. A woman laughed on a bench. Bernard parked his wheelchair under a tree and watched Molly spread a blanket and lay out crayons. She drew a landscape with a small blue star in the corner. "You ever think about the old car?" she asked, looking up at him. He thought about the dent in the passenger door, the heater that took a minute to warm, the many small indignities of a life before changes. He thought about Richard Kavanaugh's baritone and the way it had been amplified. He thought about the night that had broken open their lives. "Sometimes," he said, "but now it's not what matters much. We have things that keep us safe. We have people who answer when we call." Molly shaded the sun from her eyes and smiled. "Good," she said. "I like this apartment." Janet knocked on the window that faced the park and waved. Fiona sent a text with a schedule for a volunteer workshop on disability accessibility. Alexandra, in the officer's suite at the tower, reviewed a quarterly report that showed the program's uptake and the number of prevented evictions. The work continued, the kind of work that does not end with a press release, but that unfolds in the slow weather of policy and habit. The final public moment of vindication, if one could call it that, did not arrive as a single triumphant victory. It came in many small validations. A promoted HR leader who had once been ignored, a changed security protocol that prevented another intimidation, an employee who told a coworker that they could now call a hotline without fear. It came in the knowledge that a phrase like, "it's junk," no longer functioned as an unquestioned decree. It now required context, and that context, increasingly, demanded accountability. Bernard still had nights when the old life intruded, the ache in his chest at being less independent, the small humiliation of adaptations that never felt elegant. He also had mornings when Molly would leap into his lap and recite times tables with a flourish, and he would feel that the work had been worth every indignity they had faced to get here. He had become, in the quiet and the loud ways, an advocate and a father, and a man who had learned how to wield new forms of power, moral authority, the school's PTA, the mic at a conference. He did not pretend the world was repaired. He knew better. But he also watched the company he had once cleaned change in ways that made a measurable difference. People who had been complicit in creating the environment that led to his attack were gone, or were answering for their actions.
New policy tools were being tested in other companies. Local nonprofits reported new funding streams. The city council began hearings about municipal protections for workers targeted by smear campaigns, a conversation that had been inconceivable before Bernard's night became a lesson. At the end of the day, in the small kitchen with the kettle and the crumbs on the counter, Bernard would make noodles for Molly, check the locks on the door, and write in his notebook ideas for program improvements. He remained stoic in that very human way. New policy tools were being tested in other companies. Local nonprofits reported new funding streams. The city council began hearings about municipal protections for workers targeted by smear campaigns, a conversation that had been inconceivable before Bernard's night became a lesson. At the end of the day, in the small kitchen with the kettle and the crumbs on the counter, Bernard would make noodles for Molly, check the locks on the door, and write in his notebook ideas for program improvements. He remained stoic in that very human way. He carried forward with a mix of fatigue and stubborn purpose. He attended rehab appointments, yes, but he also coached a group of workers on how to advocate for themselves inside a bureaucracy that still preferred pat answers, but that could be shifted by consistent pressure. The narrative, once so nearly simple, had grown complicated in precisely the way real life does. Shame and mockery had been met not with equivalent contempt, but with a long process of repair. Justice had not arrived as a single headline. It had arrived as a commitment to structures that would not let one voice be silenced for convenience. Bernard had become both beneficiary and agent of that change. If this story leaves you with one impression, let it be this: courage matters, and systems must answer when they harm the vulnerable. One man's act of quick human bravery exposed not only the fragility of public narratives, but also the responsibility that falls on institutions when someone is harmed in their name. Repair is messy and long, and it is never finished. It is steady work, built on the bones of policy and the muscle of human compassion. If this story moved you, consider learning more about workplace justice resources and supporting organizations that help employees navigate crises. Their work helps make practical the kind of support that kept Bernard and Molly afloat when the world shouted and when the night threatened to take everything. Share this story with someone who needs to hear how power, responsibility, and repair can intersect to make life livable again. Bernard folded his notebook closed, kissed Molly's forehead, and rolled the chair to the window. He watched the city lights blink on, one by one, as if each small bulb were a promise that for now they would keep moving forward. He had saved a life once with his hands. Now he used his voice to protect others. That, in the end, felt like enough to keep him going.